There once was a man who was a very, very powerful baron. And he had a son. And on his son's 4th birthday, he decided he wanted to find out who his son would marry. So he went and he consulted with the fates. And they told him that his son would marry the daughter of the pauper that lived down in the village. Exactly. Baby who was born that very day, and he was incensed. No son of his would ever marry the child of a pauper. So he got on his horse and he rode down into the town, and there he saw the pauper sitting outside of his hut, crying, sobbing. And he said to the man, "What's wrong?" And the man said, "My wife just had another baby. We already had 9 children, now we had 10. We couldn't feed the 9 we had, and now there's a 10th. I don't know what we're going to do. We'll all starve because of this baby." And the baron said, "Oh, no, no, no. Bring her to me. I'll take care of her for you." So the man said, "Thank you, sir, thank you." And he ran into the hut and he grabbed that brand new baby out of his wife's arms, ran out and handed that baby to the baron. "Thank you, sir, thank you." And the baron said, "Think nothing of it." And he rode away. He reached the banks of the river and he stopped for a while. He watched the sunlight sparkling on the water of the river. And then he threw the baby in the river and turned and rode away. Now, fortunately for the baby, as she was falling, the air caught in her swaddling clothes. And when she landed on the river, she didn't sink. She floated out to sea, where a fisherman who had always wanted a child, he and his wife had for years longed for a child. This fisherman saw a little pile of rags out in the water, and as he went closer, he could hear sounds coming from that little pile of rags, and when he walked up to it, it was a baby girl. The most beautiful baby girl he'd ever seen in his life. She was a gift from God, and he picked her up and he ran home to his wife and he said, "Finally, our prayers have been answered. We have a daughter. We have a daughter." And those parents loved that baby more than any parents have ever loved a child. But when she was 12, that girl's mother died. And she then became the woman of the house. She cooked for her father and cleaned and sewed and mended his nets so that he could continue to fish. And she became an amazingly good cook. And she grew in beauty. And one day when she was 16, her father ran into the house and said, "Quick, quick, quick, there's a hunting party come. They look like they're very important people. We have to put out the very best food we can." And she said, don't worry. And she fixed for them, using the only food they had left in the house, a feast that was not fit for people of nobility, but the best that fisherman's family could offer. But it was delicious. It was beautiful to the eye as it was to the tongue. And when the baron had eaten his fill, he said, "Who made this meal?" The fisherman was proud of his daughter. He said, "My daughter did." "Oh, call her out. I must meet her." So the girl came out and was introduced to the baron, who looked her up and down and said, "Well, you're not only a good cook, you're a pretty little thing. How old are you?" And she said, "I think I'm 16. I don't know when I was born. My father found me floating in the water 16 years ago." And then the baron knew that she was the pauper's baby. "No son of mine will marry a pauper's child. She's still alive. I have to get rid of her." "Girl," he says, "I have a brother who has a great house and is in need of a cook. Would you go to my brother's house and cook for him?" And as much as she did not want to leave her father, they both knew that living in a fisherman's hut was no life for a young girl, and she would never have a life if she stayed. So they bid each other farewell, and the baron gave the girl a note to take to his brother, and some money, because he knew she couldn't walk the entire way that day. So she set off walking, and at the end of the day, she had come to a small town where there was a little inn. And she got a room upstairs in the inn, And no sooner had she settled in than she began to hear noises downstairs, crashing and bumping and yelling and shouting. There were highwaymen who had come to that inn to rob it that very night. And as she cowered in her room, the door was kicked open, and the 4 men came flooding into her room. "Oh, little girl," they said, grabbed her by the shoulders, threw her into the closet, and locked her in. And she could hear them rifling through her things outside and laughing at what little meager possessions she had. And then she heard one of them say, "Oh, look, a letter. Let's see what this says." She heard the steel break. "Dear brother, when you receive the bearer of this letter, I wish you to immediately..." There was silence. Because what the man had read was, "When you receive this letter, I wish you to immediately put its bearer to death." Well, they were highwaymen, but they weren't murderers. And they rifled through the desk in that room until they found paper and they found pen, and they wrote a new letter. "Dear brother, when you receive this letter, I wish you to marry the bearer of it to my son, your brother Robert." And they folded it and sealed it, and the girl never knew what had been in the first letter, nor did she know that the second was a replacement. And they let her out of the closet, and the next morning, when she set off on her way, she had with her the new letter. When she arrived at the Baron's brother's house, he welcomed her in. He opened the letter. It so happened that the Baron's young son was staying with him, now a lad of 20. The Baron was overjoyed, called the two of them together, and said, "You shall be wed this very day." And they both liked the look of the other, and they were both happy enough with it, and so they were wed. A week later, the Baron arrived at his brother's house, and imagine his dismay when the door opened, and there stood the pauper's daughter. Well, he didn't let it show. He put a smile on his face. He sat down to the meal with the rest, and when the meal was over, he turned to his son and said, "My son, you wouldn't mind, would you, if I were to take my new daughter for a walk so that we might get to know each other a little?" And of course, neither the son nor the daughter-in-law suspected. And so the Baron and the girl walked along a little path, stopped at the cliff overlooking the ocean. And suddenly that pleasant conversation they'd been having turned dark. "How dare you, someone of your station, presume to marry my son? This will never be. You were never supposed to have married him in the first place." And he grabbed her by the shoulders, and he began to drag her towards the cliff, but she was young and she was strong, and she fought him off. And he said, finally, when he couldn't drag her over, he took off his ring and he said, "All right, I'll let you live. But don't you ever darken my door unless you have my ruby ring in your hand." And he threw it as far out into the waves as he could. What was she to do? She was far from home. She had no money. She didn't know where she was. She couldn't go back. And so she set off walking. And fortunately, before night fell, she saw a great house. And when she knocked on the door, they didn't need a cook, but they did need a scullery maid to scrub the pots and pans. And so she got a job, and she began to work. Every now and then, she would convince the cook to let her into the kitchen. And everyone was amazed at the way she could cook. So when one day a certain hunting party arrived at that great house, the fish were brought in to be served to the guests. And when the girl looked out and saw who was in the hunting party, who do you imagine it was? But her father-in-law, the Baron. So she went to the cook and said, "Can I just this once, can I make the dish only for the Baron? You can cook for everyone else, but may I make the fish for the Baron?" And the cook said, "Yes, you may." And when she cut the fish open, and began to gut it, what do you think was inside that fish? The ruby ring. She cooked the fish. She arranged it beautifully on the dish. It was taken out, and of course the Baron had to know who it was that had cooked this fish for him. It was the most delicious thing he'd ever seen or eaten. And so she was called out. And when she walked out, the girl was wearing the ruby ring on her thumb. When he saw her, the blood drained from his face. Tell them who you are, she said. Tell them what you did, she said. And he was silent. Tell them what you did, or I will tell them, she said. Well, that was enough to convince him, because he confessed then to the entire party, not only trying to throw her over the cliff, but the 2 other times he had tried to kill her that she didn't even know about, by the letter to his brother and by throwing her into the river in the first place. And now the original story says that all was forgiven, that she was invited back into his household, and they all lived happily ever after. And maybe that's what happened. Or maybe he was called before a magistrate and got his due. I don't know. Only you can decide.
Thank you.